The call came in just before sunrise on a cold November morning in 1998. The voice on the other end was shaky, barely above a whisper. A neighbor, an older woman who lived alone, reported hearing strange sounds coming from the house next door. It wasn't the first time. She had heard soft cries in the past, sometimes muffled sobs, other times a single heartbreaking wail that was quickly silenced. But this time, something was different. There was a loud thud, followed by a long stretch of silence. Then, nothing. Ridgewood was a small town where everyone knew each other. Crime was rare, and people prided themselves on looking out for their neighbors. The Wilkins family had lived there for nearly a decade, and by all appearances they were a normal household. James Wilkins worked in construction while his wife Linda was a homemaker. They had 2 children, Daniel, 10, and Sarah, 6. People often saw James working on home improvement projects in the yard, while Linda was known for keeping a pristine garden. The children, however, were a mystery. They were rarely seen outside, never invited to birthday parties, and hardly spoke when they did appear in public. But in a town where people minded their own business, no one questioned it too much. 2 officers arrived at the Wilkins home within minutes of the call. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of a television flickering behind the curtains. James answered the door, his expression one of mild confusion. Linda stood behind him, arms crossed, her face blank. When asked if everything was all right, James nodded. "Just a quiet night in," he said casually. The officers explained the reason for their visit, mentioning the concerned neighbor's call. Linda let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "She's always imagining things," she said. "We've told her before, our kids are just a little restless at night." Daniel and Sarah appeared in the doorway a moment later. The officers noted how still they were, how their eyes seemed hollow. Sarah clung to the hem of her mother's sweater, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric tightly. Daniel stood with his arms pressed to his sides, barely blinking. One of the officers crouched slightly to meet Daniel's eye level, offering a reassuring smile. "Everything okay, buddy?" he asked. The boy hesitated, glancing quickly at his father before nodding. "Yeah," he whispered. The officers scanned the room, their eyes falling on the staircase leading down to the basement. One of them took a small step forward, but James quickly blocked the way. "Basement's just for storage," he said. His tone was light, but there was something forced about it. The officers had no legal reason to push further. There were no visible signs of harm, no evidence of a crime. After a few more routine questions they left, reassuring the neighbor that everything seemed fine. But 2 weeks later, Daniel Wilkins disappeared without a trace. The search for Daniel Wilkins began the morning his parents reported him missing. They claimed he had run away in the middle of the night, slipping out through his bedroom window without a sound. Linda sobbed as she spoke to the police, her hands shaking as she clutched a framed photo of her son. James stood beside her, his jaw clenched, his eyes red-rimmed. He told officers that Daniel had always been a difficult child, prone to mood swings and outbursts. "He must have planned this," James said. "Maybe he wanted to punish us." The town mobilized quickly. Volunteers combed through the woods surrounding Ridgewood, their flashlights cutting through the dense fog that rolled in with the early winter mornings. Flyers with Daniel's face were plastered on every street corner, in grocery stores and outside the local school. But despite all efforts, there was no sign of him. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually the searches became less frequent. The news coverage dwindled and people moved on. Sarah, however, had not moved on. She still lived in the Wilkins house, growing quieter with each passing day. Teachers at her school noticed she hardly spoke anymore. When asked about Daniel, she simply shrugged. Her small frame seemed even thinner than before, her pale skin taking on an almost ghostly quality. And then there were the bruises. At first they were small, faint marks on her arms, a shadow of a bruise on her neck. Linda always had an explanation. "She's clumsy," she'd say, always tripping over her own feet. No one questioned it too much at first. Accidents happened. Children fell. But as time went on, the injuries became harder to ignore. One day, a teacher spotted deep purple marks around Sarah's wrists, almost like fingerprints. When asked about them, Sarah stared at the floor and mumbled something about playing too rough. Concerned, the school contacted Child Protective Services. A caseworker visited the Wilkins home, but Linda was prepared. She smiled warmly, invited the woman in, and answered every question with ease. That night, the postal worker couldn't sleep. The sound he had heard nagged at him. The next morning, he made an anonymous call to the police, reporting strange noises at the Wilkins home. It was enough for the authorities to take a second look. Within the hour, officers arrived at the house for a welfare check. James answered the door this time, his face unreadable. When the officers asked to come inside, he hesitated, glancing toward the hallway as if considering his options. Linda appeared behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder before stepping forward with her usual warm smile. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Come in." The officers entered, scanning the living room and kitchen. Everything looked normal, too. Normal. There were no signs of struggle, no visible distress, but the atmosphere was heavy, the silence unnatural. One of the officers spotted Sarah sitting stiffly on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes flickered toward the basement door just for a second before dropping to the floor. "Would you mind if we take a look downstairs?" one of the officers asked. James chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's a mess down there," he said. "Just a storage space, really." Linda added quickly, "There's nothing to see, but go ahead if you'd like." The officer nodded and approached the basement door. As he reached for the handle, he noticed deep scratches along the wood, thin, frantic marks, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. He exchanged a look with his partner before turning the knob. The stench hit them instantly, a mix of rot, dampness, and something else, something sickly sweet. The beam of a flashlight swept across the room, revealing the horrors within. In the corner, beneath a filthy blanket, a small hand protruded, a hand that no longer moved. The room was eerily silent as the officers stepped into the basement, their stomachs twisting at the overwhelming stench. The air was thick with decay, making it difficult to breathe. The dim light from their flashlights flickered over the grimy concrete walls, revealing old stains and deep scratches embedded into the wood near the doorway. The officers moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the room. Then one of them stopped. Abruptly, a small, lifeless hand protruded from beneath a dirty, tattered blanket in the corner of the room. For a moment, neither officer moved. Then, with careful precision, one of them stepped forward and pulled the blanket back. Beneath it lay the remains of Daniel Wilkins. His body was frail, reduced to little more than skin and bone. His face was sunken, his cheeks hollow, his limbs unnaturally twisted. His wrists and ankles were raw, the skin torn from what appeared to be prolonged restraint. His clothes were filthy and tattered, barely clinging to his skeletal frame. The officers exchanged a horrified glance before stepping back, their radios crackling as they called for backup. Within minutes, the house was swarming with police officers, forensic investigators, and child welfare officials. Linda and James Wilkins were taken into custody without resistance. Linda sobbed as they led her away, insisting they had done nothing wrong. James remained silent, his face unreadable, his eyes cold. Sarah was immediately removed from the home and placed in protective custody. As investigators combed through the house, they uncovered even more disturbing evidence. The basement was not just a place of neglect, it had been a chamber of torture. The restraints on the walls, the crude mattress stained with old blood, the broken toys scattered in the corner, it all told a chilling story of what Daniel had endured. The autopsy confirmed the worst. Daniel had suffered months, possibly years, of severe abuse. His body bore the scars of old injuries, fractured ribs, healed burns, and evidence of prolonged starvation. He had been beaten, deprived of food, and left to waste away in the darkness of the basement. The final cause of death was a combination of starvation and blunt force trauma to the head. The medical examiner determined that he had died days, possibly weeks, before his body was discovered. Sarah's testimony painted an even darker picture. She revealed that Daniel had been kept in the basement for months at a time, only brought upstairs when their parents decided to punish him further. She, too, had suffered, though not as severely, perhaps because she had learned early on to obey without question. She described how their parents would taunt Daniel, withholding food and water, making him beg for even the smallest scraps. And when he grew too weak to cry, they simply left him in the dark to wither away. The town of Ridgewood, once peaceful and quiet, was now haunted by the truth. The Wilkins family home, once just another house on the street, had become a symbol of unimaginable horror. And yet the worst was still to come. The trial of James and Linda Wilkins became one of the most shocking cases in Ridgewood's history. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with journalists, townspeople, and officials who had once believed the Wilkinses were just another quiet, suburban family. Now, they were known as monsters. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Photos of Daniel's frail body, medical reports detailing his prolonged abuse, and Sarah's heartbreaking testimony painted a horrific picture of what had happened inside that house. Sarah, just 6 years old, sat before the jury and spoke in a quiet, emotionless voice. She described how Daniel had been locked away for days, sometimes weeks, in total darkness. How he cried at first, begging to be let out, only for their parents to laugh or ignore him entirely. When he grew too weak to make noise, they would throw food just out of his reach, watching as he crawled toward it, only to take it away at the last moment. She told them how her parents had forced her to watch, warning her that if she misbehaved, she would be next. The prosecution left no room for doubt. The Wilkinses had not just neglected their children. They had tortured them. The scratches on the basement door matched Daniel's tiny fingernails. The restraints on the walls showed how he had been bound for hours at a time. The autopsy confirmed repeated starvation, beatings, and untreated injuries spanning years. The jury only needed 2 hours to reach a verdict, guilty on all charges. James and Linda Wilkins were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As they were led out of the courtroom, Linda wept uncontrollably, still insisting she had done nothing wrong. James remained silent, his cold expression unchanged. But the trial had done more than just send them to prison. It had exposed the failure of the system meant to protect children like Daniel and Sarah. The school had noticed the bruises. The neighbor had heard the cries. Even the police had visited the house before Daniel disappeared. And yet, nothing had been done until it was too late. Sarah was placed in foster care far away from Ridgewood. She was given a new name, a new home, and a chance to start over. But some wounds never fully heal. Even as she grew older, the memories of that basement, of Daniel's fading voice, never left her. In an interview years later, she admitted she still woke up in the middle of the night, hearing his voice whispering her name. The Wilkins house stood abandoned for years. No one wanted to live there. Eventually, it was torn down. The land left, empty, as if trying to erase the horrors that had happened within its walls. But the people of Ridgewood never forgot. The name, Daniel Wilkins, became a reminder of the worst kind of evil. The kind that hides in plain sight, behind closed doors, in the homes of those who are supposed to love you the most.